Between 1820 and 1840, roughly 3,000 men disappeared into the Rocky Mountains to trap beaver. They are remembered as the mountain men, the toughest breed of human the American frontier ever produced. They wrestled grizzly bears, survived avalanches, and crossed deserts where some resorted to eating insects and leather just to stay alive. But there was something in those mountains that killed far more trappers than any bear, any blizzard, or any hostile war party, and it was small enough to fit in the palm of your hand. It was a berry, sometimes red, sometimes white, sometimes purple, growing quietly along the same cold mountain streams where trappers set their beaver traps, hiding in the same shaded forests where they built their camps. And unlike a grizzly, it never gave you a warning growl before it killed you. To understand how a berry could be deadlier than a bear, you have to understand what daily life actually looked like for these men. Hollywood gave us the image of the rugged mountain man roasting elk over a roaring fire, sleeping under the stars with a full belly. The reality was starvation. Constant, grinding, desperate starvation. The fur trade demanded that trappers push deeper into unmapped territory where game was unpredictable. A trapper could go days without killing anything. Weeks, even. Jedediah Smith led 2 men across the Great Basin Desert in 1826, and for 32 days they survived on insects, rodents, and whatever scraps of moisture they could wring from the sand. When they finally staggered into the Cache Valley Rendezvous in Utah, the other trappers fired a cannon in salute because everyone had assumed they were dead. During the long winter months, when snow buried the mountain passes and temperatures dropped well below zero, food became an obsession. Journals from the period describe men boiling their own moccasins into a kind of leather soup. Others chewed strips of rawhide or gnawed on tree bark just to keep something in their stomachs. The mountain men dressed in stiffened deerskin suits that offered some protection against weapons and weather. But no amount of leather armor could protect a man from his own hunger, and when you are that hungry, when your body is screaming at you for calories, you start looking at everything around you as potential food: roots, leaves, and especially berries, because berries look safe. They look familiar. You grew up eating blueberries and strawberries back east. You watched birds eating wild berries in the forest, and you figured if a bird could eat them, so could you. That assumption killed more men than anyone bothered to count. The most treacherous berry growing in the Rocky Mountain forests was baneberry. The name itself is a warning if you know your Old Norse. Bane comes from the word bani, which means slayer, baneberry, the murder berry, and it earned that name across centuries of grief. Red baneberry grows throughout the Rocky Mountain forests in shaded understory areas, beneath the canopy of pines, spruce, and aspen. It produces clusters of glossy, vivid red berries that practically glow against the dark green forest floor. They look like tiny, perfect cherries. To a starving trapper stumbling through a Montana woodland in late summer, they would have looked like a gift from the wilderness itself. The white variety is even more striking and far more unnerving. Sometimes called doll's eyes, each white berry sits on a thick, bright pink stalk and has a single black dot in the center that looks exactly like a tiny porcelain doll staring up at you from the forest floor. Both types contain cardiogenic toxins that attack the heart muscle directly. The specific compounds have never been fully identified, but the effect is well documented. Within minutes of eating a handful of baneberries, the toxins begin sedating cardiac tissue, the heartbeat slows, the rhythm becomes irregular, and if enough berries were consumed, the heart simply stops. There are no dramatic convulsions. There is no week-long decline. Your heart just quits. In a mountain camp hundreds of miles from the nearest settlement, that meant death with no witness and no explanation. Just another trapper who went out one morning and never came back. His partners might find him days later, face down near a bush with a handful of crushed berries still in his fist, and they would have no way to connect the two. Native American tribes knew baneberry intimately. Some used carefully prepared extractions from the roots as a hunting poison. Others used controlled doses medicinally for treating snakebite and childbirth pain, which tells you everything you need to know about the razor-thin line between remedy and death in wilderness plant knowledge. That line required generations of accumulated wisdom to walk safely, and the mountain men arriving from cities like St. Louis and Pittsburgh simply did not have it. But baneberry was far from the only killer growing along those trap lines, and some of the plants waiting in the Rocky Mountain wilderness did not even need to look like a berry to end a man's life. The most dangerous plant waiting for these men along the Rocky Mountain waterways was water hemlock. Botanists today still call it the most violently toxic plant in North America. It grows in marshy ground, along stream banks, in the wet meadows and ditches that mountain men gravitated toward naturally, because that is where the beaver lived. That is where they set their traps each morning, wading knee-deep or waist-deep in freezing water to position the steel jaws just right. That is where they made camp each night. They were literally sleeping next to the deadliest plant on the continent, and most of them had absolutely no idea. Water hemlock belongs to the same plant family as carrots, celery, and parsnips. That is not a coincidence. That is the entire problem. The roots of water hemlock look almost identical to wild parsnip. The leaves resemble those of a dozen edible plants in the same family. The stems are hollow, similar to wild celery, and the small white flowers bloom in umbrella-shaped clusters that could easily be mistaken for harmless Queen Anne's lace. A starving trapper who dug up what he thought was a wild carrot or parsnip root along a mountain stream had just unknowingly grabbed the most toxic thing growing within 500 miles. The poison is called cicutoxin, and what it does to the human body is the stuff of nightmares. Within 15 minutes of swallowing even a small piece of the root, the toxin begins attacking a neurotransmitter in the brain called GABA. Under normal conditions, GABA acts like a brake pedal for your nervous system. It keeps your brain cells from firing too fast. Cicutoxin rips that brake pedal clean off. Every muscle in the body starts firing at once. The jaw clamps shut so hard that victims chew their own tongues to ribbons. The arms twist backward. The back arches violently. Convulsions throw the body around like a rag doll while vomiting and frothing at the mouth make breathing nearly impossible. One foraging expert described it this way: the jaw muscles contract 10 or 20 times harder than they normally do, and you cannot open your mouth. Death usually comes from respiratory failure within a few hours. The Iroquois nation reportedly used water hemlock as a deliberate suicide method, and they chose it specifically because it caused the most agonizing death they knew of. Now picture a trapper in 1832, camped alone along a creek in what is now Montana. He has not eaten in 3 days. The snow is melting, and new green plants are pushing up through the wet soil near the water. He sees a plant with white umbrella-shaped flowers, notices the familiar parsley-like leaves, and digs up the root. It looks pale and fleshy, just like the wild parsnips he ate back in Missouri. He takes a bite. 15 minutes later, he is in convulsions on the ground with nobody within 50 miles who could help him. Even if someone had been standing right there was nothing they could do. The Rocky Mountains had no doctors, no hospitals, and nothing resembling an antidote. Trappers set their own broken bones, stitched their own wounds with sinew, and buried their own dead. If you ate the wrong plant, you simply died, and nobody wrote down what happened. If you are finding this useful, consider hitting subscribe. I cover forgotten frontier history and wilderness survival stories every week. But water hemlock was not the only killer hiding in plain sight. There was another plant, and this one was arguably even more terrifying because you did not even have to touch it to die from it. White snakeroot is a modest-looking wildflower with clusters of small white blooms that grows in shaded woodland areas throughout the Midwest and along the edges of the Rocky Mountain frontier. It stands about 3 feet tall, has pointed oval leaves, and looks completely harmless. A settler walking past it in an Indiana forest clearing would never give it a second glance. But white snakeroot contains a toxin called trematol, and here is what made it so uniquely devastating. Cattle that grazed on white snakeroot absorbed the poison into their tissues. The trematol accumulated in their muscles and concentrated in their milk. When settlers drank that milk or ate butter or cheese made from it, they developed a condition that frontier communities came to call milk sickness. Some called it the trembles, or puking fever, or the slows. The symptoms started slowly. Loss of appetite, a strange weakness in the limbs. Then came the vomiting, the severe constipation, and a distinctive sour or acetone-like smell on the victim's breath that neighbors learned to dread. Because once that smell appeared, everyone knew what was coming. Muscle stiffness set in until the body could barely move. The tongue turned red and swollen. Abdominal pain became unbearable. And then, after about a week of constant suffering, the coma. And then death. Milk sickness killed thousands of settlers across Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, Ohio, and Tennessee in the early 1800s. In some frontier communities along the Ohio River Valley, the fatality rate was so catastrophic that half the settlers in a settlement might die from this single cause. Half. Entire families wiped out because their cow wandered into the wrong patch of woods during a dry spell and ate the wrong wildflower. Doctors at the time tried bloodletting, which was standard medical practice for diseases they did not understand. It did absolutely nothing. The Kentucky General Assembly was so desperate that in 1830 they offered a $600 reward to anyone who could identify the cause. Nobody collected. The most famous victim was Nancy Hanks Lincoln, the mother of Abraham Lincoln. In the autumn of 1818, milk sickness swept through the Little Pigeon Creek settlement in southern Indiana. Nancy had been nursing sick neighbors, including her own aunt and uncle, Elizabeth and Thomas Sparrow, who both died from the disease weeks before Nancy fell ill. She was 34 years old. Her son Abraham, just 9 years old, watched her suffer for about a week before she died on October 5th. He helped his father whipsaw logs into planks and whittle wooden pegs to build her coffin. They buried her on a hill south of the family farm. Records from Dubois County, Indiana, during this period show that more than half of all recorded deaths could be attributed to this one plant. And here is the part that makes this story even worse. The answer was already known. Native Americans had identified white snakeroot as the killer long before the first settler arrived. A Shawnee woman later shared this knowledge with a frontier doctor named Anna Pierce Hobbs Bixby, whose own mother had died of milk sickness. Bixby tested the theory by feeding white snakeroot to a calf. The calf died. She had her proof. She tried to warn her community and wrote about her findings. But the American medical community did not officially confirm the cause of milk sickness until 1928. Over 100 years of preventable death. That pattern of ignored knowledge runs through this entire story. The Crow, the Shoshone, the Blackfoot, the Nez Perce, the Arapaho, they all maintain detailed generational knowledge about which plants healed, which plants fed, and which plants killed. This was not casual trivia. This was survival curriculum refined over centuries of observation, tested through bitter experience, and passed from grandmothers to granddaughters and from fathers to sons. When a trapper married into one of these tribes, which many did, he gained access to a body of knowledge that could keep him alive every single day. Jim Beckworth married into the Crow Nation and lived to be 68. Kit Carson married into the Arapaho and Cheyenne and gained survival skills that made him legendary. The men who lasted longest in the mountains were almost always the ones who formed these connections and learned from them. But plenty of trappers never did. Many were teenagers. Kit Carson was 16 when he first headed west. Jim Bridger was 17. Others were even younger, boys from farms and river towns who signed up with the Rocky Mountain Fur Company or the American Fur Company for the promise of adventure and money. They pushed into unmapped territory each season, living on whatever they could kill or find. The annual rendezvous gatherings, where hundreds of trappers met supply caravans to trade their furs, were legendary for drinking, gambling, wrestling, and storytelling. What they were not was a classroom for botanical education. A man might hear a second-hand warning about a particular plant over a jug of raw whiskey, but there was no guarantee he would remember it when he was starving in a snowbound canyon 3 months later. The question you might be asking is how many mountain men actually died from poisonous plants, and the honest answer is we will never know the precise number. The Rocky Mountains had no coroners, no death certificates, and no medical records of any kind. When a trapper died alone in the wilderness, his body might not be found for months or years, or ever. The cause of death was usually recorded, if anyone recorded it at all, as simply unknown or found dead. But we can piece together what we know. We know starvation drove men to eat whatever they could find. We know the deadliest plants in North America grew in exactly the habitats where trappers spent their working lives. And we know that grizzly bear attacks, while dramatic and terrifying, were actually survivable far more often than the legends suggest. Hugh Glass survived his mauling. So did many others who carried devastating scars for the rest of their lives. A grizzly attack was brutal, but it gave you a fighting chance. There was no fighting chance against a toxic root or a poisoned berry, and that is what makes this story matter beyond the 1800s. These plants have not gone anywhere. Water hemlock still grows along streams, marshes, and irrigation ditches across North America. Baneberry still produces those glossy red clusters in shaded mountain forests every summer. Foraging has surged in popularity over the last decade, and poisoning cases still make the medical journals. People in Maine were hospitalized in the early 1990s after mistaking water hemlock for wild vegetables. Children in Oregon died from biting water hemlock roots decades ago, and the warning still echoes. The same confusion that killed mountain men in 1830 can kill a weekend forager today. If this kind of forgotten frontier history interests you, check out the video on screen right now. I think you are going to want to see this one.